joining us for the very first time to the SoCreative 2021 finale. My name is Rudo, and we are getting ready to get into our round table discussion under the following topic: Africa's creative economy, a key driver for sustainable development towards the Africa we want. But before we begin, I'm going to give you guys a bit more information on our panel for today's discussion. Our panelists are as follows. To start off, we have got Skinder Hundal, who is the British Council Global Arts Director, who gave us a very powerful big idea talk. We'll also be joined by Farai Mpfunya from Zimbabwe, and he is the UNESCO Expert Facility Member and an Africa Arts and Cultural Expert. One moment, there is a poll that has just popped up on our screen. So please could you fill that through? Okay, it's disappeared. So I'm just gonna give everybody one moment. Okay, there we go. Apologies. Well, there is going to be a survey that we have to fill in. So I'm just going to repeat that. We've got Skinder Hundal, who's the British Council Global Arts Director. We've got Farai Mpfunya, who is UNESCO Expert Facility Member, as well as an Africa Arts and Cultural Expert. He is also co-founder and executive director of the Culture Fund Trust of Zimbabwe. We also have Boitumelo, who is from the Business of Art South Africa. She is also one of our speakers that we had for this year's Digital Meetups. We also have Josiane Faubert from Gabon. She is the founder of Peaches Stock, and I did not mention Boitumelo is from South Africa. And our moderator for today's roundtable panel discussion is Rudo Nyangulu-Mungofa from Zimbabwe. She is the 2020 to 21 SoCreative Summit Director, as well as the founder and executive director of Stimulus Africa. And I'll hand over this conversation to Rudo. Rudo, over to you.
Thank you, Tendo, and thank you, Lady Chawe and Skinder, for this really great for the performance and that really great talk that just really framed this session today really nicely. We've taken note of those the 6-pack, and we'll definitely be unpacking that and really gleaning more from it, and in many ways applying some of those principles. So as we get started, and we're hoping to make this a very conversational session where very practical as well for the young creatives that are in the room, but also, you know, trying to sort of bring the balance between some of the necessary theoretical issues around, you know, achieving the Africa we want, around sustainable development, very big terms, really big, broad areas, but really looking forward to definitely unpacking that with our panel. And to start off with, I think borrowing from that beautiful poem of Home and the poetry that Lady Chawe shared with us, in thinking of storytelling being a creative and cultural sector, the process of defining and telling your story and being in many ways the custodian of your story and determining how you are viewed is something that we haven't been able to do as well in the past as a continent. But to achieve the Africa we want, we need to start thinking about the positioning of who we are, the stories that we tell about ourselves, the stories that are told about us, who is the custodian or who is the driver of our story. And I'd like to maybe pose a question first to yourself, Farai, being our resident arts and cultural expert. And this is a term we've given him, so no pressure at all. Farai, how important is the power of our story in driving towards the sustainable development that globally that we seek, but as a continent that we desperately need, where sustainable development for us is so intrinsically linked with economic development, with social development. It's not divorced, it's not just environmental, but it's a holistic need for development for the continent. How important is storytelling and sitting in that discourse around sustainable development. Farai?
Thanks very much, Rudo. First of all, I'd like to once again thank you, Stimulus Africa and SoCreative, you in particular, director for this particular one. And thanks to the partners who have made this possible. It is a platform for actually addressing the issues of regaining the power to tell a different kind of story for Africa. And therefore, I would like to applaud everyone who's taken time to come and listen in to the new narratives that are emerging from this exercise. It's a very important, I think we a couple of years ago, you and your colleagues invited me to come and share some thoughts around the African worldview and what therefore needed to be done to plant new trees, human trees, especially those working in the innovative and creative spaces in Africa. And if at all they will be in any way able to change the course of history across Africa, and why should innovation and creativity be the deciding factor in moving Africa towards a different direction? I think the important thing about stories is that humanity's evolution is an evolution of the challenges, the responses to circumstance, to the elements, and these overcoming exercises were told in stories. And some told their stories better and inspired future generations on how to overcome, how to innovate, and how to learn. Others were not as successful as others. And over time, as the esteemed Nigerian writer Ngozi Chimamanda Adichie said about the dangers of a single narrative, is that Africa itself then suffered in the recent history. When I say recent history, is perhaps the colonial era going forward, where the narrative was changed for Africa by outsiders of the continent. And that narrative was a continent of people who are lazy, people who are not innovative, and people who are not capable of solving their problems, and people who were not as dynamic as others. That narrative has got to change. And the change will start with self-talk, with us Africans telling ourselves, within ourselves, a different kind of story about our capacity, about our capability. But you can have the whole webinar on just storytelling. I'll stop here for now.
Absolutely, and I like what you say there, Farai, when in framing it in this danger of a single story, and also at the same time the narrative that exists, and yes, borrowing perhaps or as a result of our colonial past, but looking forward and looking at where the global world is going and moving, and the trajectory that Africa needs to go with it. There are so many platforms and spaces that tell various stories that present and project images of all sorts of things and all sorts of stories. And very few of those, to me, are actually African platforms that are driving African stories. What is the danger of that, of utilizing channels that are not authentically or contextually designed to propel that African story, when wanting to engage, for example, with on par with other global stories? If we look at the British stories, the European and American, these are economies and countries that are able to effectively tell their stories using platforms they create, and commerce results from this. Yet we're in a space as a continent where we don't seem to create the platforms and the channels to then be able to own how we drive the story. To me, what would you say we need to be doing? Where should we be positioning our thinking? Certainly as an ecosystem of young creatives and social impact entrepreneurs, how do we position ourselves in a way that we can now drive not just telling single stories, but now moving towards developing channels and platforms that enable us to drive a plethora of stories, to me?
Firstly, I want to say I'm so excited, and thank you so much for including me in this discussion today. I think you touched on some of the points that I wanted to kind of contribute in this discussion, and one of them is around ownership, right? Like, until we own the platforms, then we can't, or maybe we're limited in the ways in which we can intentionally share the stories we want to share. So even though digital platforms like social media, the TikToks of the world, the Facebooks of the world allow us to really share individual and very diverse stories compared to the homogenous kind of narrative of Africa as one country or one type of people. So I think we can leverage off of digital platforms, but I also think it's about owning and really trying to make an effort towards owning the platforms through which we're going to tell these stories. I also think that a critical place is in education. So arts education is something that I think plays a major role in terms of what we start to understand and believe about ourselves, but also about the creative sector, as well as the Africa we want. And I want to add critical arts education in that, because you can have access to arts education, but if the story that is being told about the cultural sector, the creative sector, is that the work that we do is frivolous or, a hobby or not important, then we grow up believing, we grow up believing and even embodying that kind of narrative. So you see how even as creatives, we start to say, as a creative, don't die poor, or as a creative, make sure that you diversify. When your parents are like, why are you going to follow a career in this particular field? And then you start to doubt yourself, and it really requires intentionality and even just like bravery or courage to step out of that. So I think that it's about owning the platforms, but it's also about making sure that the people who are driving the narratives, the people who have access, especially to young people, educators, facilitators, are intentional about what that story is. I think that there's also place in our policies to make sure that storytelling becomes a critical point of that. It doesn't matter if you have these amazing policies that really want to drive change. Like when you look at, Agenda 2063, who has access to that? Who is engaging with that? And what platforms or tools are we using to ensure that a wide range of individuals and communities have access not only to reading it, but also to shaping it? So I think it's the ownership, it's the critical arts education, but it's making sure that the tools and the platforms we use reach a wide range of people, not only at evaluation or implementation phase, but most importantly at conceptualization, at a conceptual stage as well.
That's so powerful, and it's so important. One of the things that we really champion as Stimulus is co-creation, and defining with, not defining for. So I really love that what you said there about the intentionality of conceptualization first, starting from the very beginning, being deliberate about how you do what you do when you're now trying to bring forth these stories. And something that has been very intentional and also very powerful that has really inspired me this year is this platform called Picture. And this platform that Josiane started really as and I'm not going to steal your thunder, Josiane, because I want you to come in now and just really tell us how have you tried to shape a different story? And when I say a different story, visually, if you turn on any sort of international news outlet, the visual story of Africa is poverty. The visual story of Africa is lack, it's less. Farai touched on this. It's, lazy, perhaps, unimaginative, maybe not innovative. So verbally, in writing, we're telling stories, but visually, we're telling stories as well. And Josiane, your inspiration to tell a different story and to change the narrative visually. Tell us a bit about that, and why is that important?
Yeah, thank you, Rudo, and hi everyone. This is an amazing platform, and I'm really happy to be here. I'm gonna start with a funny story. I feel like it's not a funny story; it's a sad story. While I was doing my business plan for Picture, I was also traveling to Togo because my husband is from Togo. And we were on the road and there were all these big billboards and every single of them had only advertisement for bleaching creams. And I was really shocked. It makes me really sad. And I was like, why is it that there's no other things? There's no advertising for oil companies, for soap, for, you know, any other product that we're using. And that when I saw that, it really reinforced my the mission that I wanted to set with Pisha, making sure that we only have relevant images for advertising, for communication and marketing, because some of my background is also in international development. And I felt that there was already too many of those images of poverty, international development, people in rural areas. And we didn't have enough of the modern Africa, people living in urban places, just people going to work, you know, dressed up like you and I today, you know, people, you know, having a normal life, that I would say a normal life, and not always being linked to some type of narratives. And I think that this was really missing. And because I was a photographer, I had done some freelance photography, when I thought about the whole project, I said, okay, let's just do it. So the great thing is that it was an era also where social media was starting. So it was really easy to start talking to other contributors. So that's the beauty also of the digital age where we are. Access and communication can really be easy. We're speaking here together today and we are in different places, which is beautiful. And we need to learn to use that also. So that's pretty much the story behind why I really feel strongly about positive imagery on Africa, but in anything that you wish in life. People are thriving for beautiful stories and positive stories. The 24-hour news outlet, they repeat all these sad stories. You know, you wake up at 1 a.m., it's the same stories that you're gonna hear at 10 a.m. again. So we need to have positive stories and we need to learn to see our stories as valuable, especially to the global stage. A lot of the time we see what we do as craft and we don't put like value into it, but there's a lot of value in our stories and our poetry, visual assets, all that we can create, writing, musical, everything that we create has value, and we need to learn to see it.
I love that everything we create has value. So true, Josiane. And, you know, in just reflecting on what you're saying, and it's so powerful how one image can just shape your mind. I remember having a conversation with you a couple of months ago as we were preparing for SoCreative, and you were sharing about your daughter and how she, because of the media and because of the images that are presented to her, she started to not like her hair, I think it was. And that is such a key lesson for, I think, all of us in thinking about how we can shape now the creative economy, the African creative economy. What are the stories that are being shared about us as creatives, as a creative sector, as a cultural sector? What are the stories that shape our work? You know, you say so powerfully that, you know, all our work has value and equal value on an equal playing field as global art. But where Edinburgh is $1 billion creative economy, on the continent, no one country, let alone a city, has that kind of impact in the creative industries. And Skinder, I want to bring you in on that, because I feel like one of the key things here is the shared learning element, and borrowing from perhaps some of your 6-pack points in terms of thinking long term. And for us, we certainly aren't going to achieve the Africa we want now. Collaboration is important and shared learning is important. And there's so much that you've been able to achieve in the UK in the creative industries in building really meaningful creative economies in cities and in the country as a whole. In the next 10 years, what are the things that you think we as an ecosystem, as a SoCreative ecosystem, can start to think about putting in place towards building our creative economies on the continent, in our countries, in our cities, borrowing from some of the lessons from Edinburgh and other places in the UK that have been very good at really harnessing those creative skills and talents and motivating and encouraging the creative industries to grow and thrive?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, really brilliant listening to my fellow speakers on this panel. And hearing their perspectives, and I think that's what's important, is about who do we listen to, who do we engage in that listening, whose voice is heard in these processes in order to create, progressive, strategy, investment policy, etc. All of that is something really important. And if you think about, if you were to get three things really right with anything in life, when it comes to creative enterprise business, I think, being clear about your kind of program initiative and purpose of that project or project that you're sharing with your beneficiaries is really important. So understanding what that is. The second thing is about communication. And this is really important, is about what story do you tell? What narratives do you share? What impacts do you share? And that's why your research, evaluation, the valorizing of your success needs to come through independent means as much as it needs to come from within. So it's either through your audiences, your beneficiaries, or independent researchers and evaluators. That needs to be built in, but that communication system is quite a complex dynamic in itself. So from product to communication is quite a complex bridge in a sense. And then I think it's about relations. If there is no trust, there is nothing to share. So it's about, how do you build trust? How do you work with a competitor in a collaborative way? How do you work with something that's commercial so that it has impact on social values as much as earn money, and define, in a sense, opportunities to have a successful life? And we are material led in this world. We're always constantly ordering this, that, and the other, and increasingly so. Those that have money, of course, those that have the privilege of that. Many people don't. I think the majority of the world is in dire poverty. This is wrong. So I think, we will achieve success only when we share these opportunities and include the sort of unimaginable, the impossible. So I think, this Stimulus African group that you've got, Rudo, SoCreative, is brilliant. I mean, bringing these fora together regularly is really important. Physically, digitally. I think the ongoing dialogue is really, really critical. I think determining the key questions of our time are really important. I think the answering of those questions can sometimes happen here. I think having that kind of approach where one can be open to change and shift, but I think it's action for me. It's about putting things into action. And so if we can put things into action, and we can find the investment and invest and get a kind of collective spirit together, that's really important. And shifting the kind of civic leadership is one of the big things right now. We must shift that civic leadership so that it embraces what creative economy is and what arts are. There is this kind of notion that creative enterprises are not arts, but it's all one part of the same economy. They all feed one another. There are various sort of black and white sort of descriptions of who we are. This is wrong. The stereotypical framing of Africa is not right either. each city, each person, each village, town has a different way of seeing things, experiencing things. Each country has a particular signature of its own. These are important factors that we need to be considering, when we're talking about the future. So there's it's a kind of a long answer again, but I think, when you're looking at the next 10 years, because that's my thing, it's about being active, being out there, and being clear about your purpose, being clear about what matters to you right now. What is it that you need to change? What are the blind spots? What are the gaps? What are the important issues? Often we spend a lot of time working on urgent things, firefighting, but they may not be important. But the problem is they are there because our systems and structures have, in a sense, failed us in a way. So, my thought on this is that get the engine right, get the magic right, get the soul clear about the essence of what SoCreative is trying to achieve, Stimulus Africa. I think it's all there. There's no doubt about it. And I think with the successes that we've had in the past, they've been driven by having the right narrative. And it does come back to story and telling that story regularly and using clever techniques and technologies, from facts, stats to animation to visuals, and using the creative sort of part of the business to really animate those kind of narratives as well. So we had a lovely poem about home, for example, just now. It just kind of defines things. I went to a launch the other day and there was just no art there. I mean, it was just like speech after speech. And in the end, I just thought, you're at an art event, you want to have a bit of poetry, you want to have a bit of kind of another way of seeing things. So in the end, I think it's about creating creative, conscious, collaborative, confident communities that come together with a passion that is kind and compassionate, with a bigger vision around the planet, about the fuller region, as well as the kind of microsite and our individual particle within all of this amazing flow. So there's a lot to unpack.
There is a lot to unpack, and we'll try and unpack as much as we can with the time we have. Thank you for that, Skinder. Really powerful. Get your engine room right. I like that so much, because often we can sit and go, but when will things change? When will things get better? When will we, and how will we? And we can talk, but I like what you said about action. It's about taking those steps. And as we take those steps, the light is shed, and very much in tune with the theme of the production for the creative production that we have this year for SoCreative, the African light. So with each step, the light shines brighter and you're able to then see your next step. So action, I love that. Get the magic right, know your purpose. Thank you for that, Skinder. And these are practical things. This is not look for a big pots of investment. This isn't change your government policy, but it starts with you, the individual, and it's the small things that we can then build. I love that. Thank you for that. Joanna from Ghana was sharing in the chat, and she says visuals and stories have the power to influence the perceptions and perspectives, especially in the subconscious. It's important we mind what we consume and the legacies we create. Very true, Joanna. And I would say we should mind what we put out as well, and be very deliberate about the images that we also project. Thank you so much for that. I want us to maybe just shift gears a little bit and just consider this creative economy and in the context of, in the framing of economic empowerment. I was in a conversation yesterday where the point was put forward that Africans are poorer than the rest of the world, which is why we don't buy art. And I had to push back on that and say that's not strictly true. The investment in the creative industries, I don't believe, is just simply a matter of our market cannot afford it. Being $1 billion market on the continent, we really have a numbers positioning, but perhaps it's the messaging now and how we are positioning the creative content, the creative products that we create on the continent. And then perhaps also an element of a Western construct on how we view value. So we value imported versus locally made. And this is having a big impact, particularly on the creative sectors in terms of profitability of individual creatives. So I'd like to unpack this and I come back to you, Farai, and maybe put forward the question to say, how can we change that particular narrative? What positioning or what things, and going back to Skinder's point of practical steps, what are the practical things we can do in our engine rooms, individually in our engine room as a ecosystem, to position ourselves so that our products and our services as creatives are valued? How do we create value that will allow us to translate what we do economically into profit and profitability or success, and sustainably so? Farai.
Well, thanks very much. I think at this stage, we're probably going back now to looking at, actual creative industries. But just coming back to stories, it is also important just to remind one another that it's not just about stories coming out of Africa. There's a responsibility to tell good stories about Africa. And good stories are based on tangible, constructive, innovative, aspirational, endeavors or activities going on within the peoples of Africa. Now, we know that a lot of younger Africans are starting to exhibit a new renaissance, a new energy. And they are now linking more and more to a sort of a reawakening of a self-imposed amnesia about the innovation and creativity that's been on the African continent, coming from the innovative strategies in military inventions of Shaka Zulu against the Brits in South Africa, to the stuff that the great Zimbabwe ancestors did with cement-free, rock-based structures of the great Zimbabwe Empire, going across to the Benin Empire with the wonderful structures that were admired and demolished when they were invaded by the Brits, whose walls were longer than the Great Wall of China, and going to the great universities of Timbuktu. Now, young Africans have got to go back there and come back to the present. So they've sort of reminded of that it's not new. We've always had these. We are now reawakening. So practically, there are a couple of things that need to happen in terms of changing the mindsets. First of all, I think I'm happy that Skinder is now Director of British Council Arts, because him and I, as cultural administrators, have been guilty of sustaining a developmental paradigm globally that sought to educate Africans, sought to mold Africans, especially younger Africans, into the images of the Western hegemonic cultures. So one of the things that would need to happen is, perhaps three things. First thing is that when we talk of best practice, like what we are doing now, it's not that we're learning from the UK or London or from the British Council. We are sharing experiences. So best practice does not mean that, you're importing something from the US, from Korea, you're importing something from South America. It just means that you are seeing what they've done. We are seeing the journey they've walked. But you yourself need to look internally for best practice. There are so many things that are happening on the continent. So instinctively for cultural and creative industries, I may need to look at the dynamic, Nollywood business model coming up, the music business coming up from Nigeria, before I look at best practice from outside Africa. Secondly, it's also the idea that once we were working with international development paradigms, we then got prescribed capacity building programs that says, okay, you lack these skills, we need to teach you how to do these skills, we need to send our experts to do this. That also needs to change, because we're now seeing that there are a lot of Africans, especially younger ones, who already are doing amazing things and they have skills. So we need to identify them and then have them perhaps just sharing the skills and creating these relationships and then ecosystems and communities that can circulate them. And then thirdly, it's the idea of, the fact that, we are made to work in certain cycles of 6 months or 2 years or 3 years. And if we do not achieve, we're then called, we do not have the political will, we do not have the desire, we don't have the energy to actually implement projects that are short term. So I do agree with Skinder there that when we start looking at 10-year cycles with embedded in there, say 3-year cycles where you're tweaking up some of your activities, then we're starting to move in a very different direction. Now, this is not new. I know in my other hat as Culture Fund Director, we have always worked in 10-year, 15-year cycles. It's just that the international development world did not see that as a practical solution. Why? Because international development assistance was tied into international cultural diplomacy, that was tied into foreign policies of the richer countries. We had cycles of political decision-making that change every 3, 4, 5 years. And I do hope that now, with a willingness to look at different cultural nuances, and again, this is where we come back to cultural and creative industries. Cultural and creative industries are just productions of goods and services that have a cultural content and do not necessarily have to have an economic value. As long as there are cultural nuances that benefit or have a public value or personal value or private value, then they are capable of being described as cultural creative industry. And therefore, there are two components that we need also to share on: the dualism of culture, which is the economic dimension of culture, but there's also the public value, intrinsic value of culture. And individuals on the continent, especially young ones, can choose what they want. But anything that has a cultural content in it, with specific cultural nuances in them, is what is going to contribute to this dynamic new energy coming out of the African continent. And I think this is where we are saying, all of us collectively, if we can harness that over a longer term period, then build the other supportive frameworks, cultural policies, investment pipelines, political will, and so forth, then we can actually foster and nurture the seeds that then can lead into the trees that Skinder talked about earlier on.
Powerful. Absolutely. So much to unpack there. And I want to bring Tumi in to weigh in on this. Last year, Farai, we convened this SoCreative platform, and we sought to define an ecosystem culture. And a lot of what you've just said really spoke to me, taking me back to that summit where we really did try to unpack. We came up with shared values. We, sought to collaborate across the continent, across borders, and the power that started, that propelled that coming together, that desire to collaborate. I think this is very much in line with your thinking around collectively coming together, creating communities, and having those communities work in a defined way. I do agree, it's not everyone who needs capacity building necessarily in a prescribed manner in a specific program, but rather working individually in collectives and tailoring support and need based on what is actually missing is very important to me. With your work at BASA and your work as a cultural practitioner, there's definitely a lot that you've already been doing around building ecosystems and connecting entrepreneurs, certainly in South Africa and possibly beyond your borders. How important is this collectiveness and community building as a base, appreciating the fact that building a community, as we've agreed already, it will take a decade or more. It's a long-term view. How important is that in terms of now starting to realize some economic value from the creative industries in a larger scale?
Thank you, Rudo. I think I just want to start to emphasize and stress that my focus and my purpose as Skinder spoke about earlier is really about publicizing and evidencing this holistic value, where the commercial and the intrinsic can all, contain equal value, as opposed to just, asking people to choose. And the work that we do at Business and Arts South Africa has shifted, in the past few years, where initially we were focusing on the business sector and wanting the business sector to really invest and understand the value of the creative sector. And then, in the past few years, we've been looking at how we build capacity of the creative sector then to be able to partner in a mutually beneficial way with the business sector. What we're realizing now is that there are major shifts, right? It's no longer the top down. It's no longer the I sponsor you and you put my logo on your poster. It really is about creating communities where multi-sectors can come into a space and share this knowledge, like Farai was speaking about. And there's something about that shared space where, and I mean, we speak about shared values, but there's also something about the diverse values coming into a room and us really talking about what that means for individuals, what that means for communities, and what that means for ecosystems, right? How do we create spaces and a place where all those diverse values can live and be actualized? I think also what becomes very crucial in terms of capacity building is about the people who are connecting the dots, the people who are creating these platforms. What agenda do we come with? What agenda do we have in mind? And what boxes do we want to tick? When we do then create these programs, how open are we about what we want to achieve? And how open are we about co-creation, co-design, and even co-evaluating the work that we're doing? I love this idea that our policies can look at 10 years and 20 years, but I also think that something that the creative sector is so unique, or what is unique about our sector, is that it's very iterative. It's very much about responding to the now, and a collective space allows us to be able to do that, right? COVID-19 hit last year. We all had to stop. We all had to review our policies, review our plans, review our strategies, and ask ourselves some critical questions around how adaptive we are, how agile we are, how flexible and open and curious about what is happening in real time. So the work that we're finding now is that it's less about a homogenous approach, it's less about a hey all, and it's more about customization. It's about listening to individuals, listening to individual lived experiences, and making sure that there's a place for that. It's making sure that, mentorship and coaching and learning and evaluating and mentoring is not about the group, but about ensuring that each voice has a place in that process. And what's dynamic is that it makes us who are creating these platforms, us who are creating these programs, it challenges us even more to interrogate the reciprocity and our willingness to hear what the people that we're here to serve, what their lived experiences are, what their expertise on the thing that we are trying to kind of connect them on, right? So it's really about that mutual benefit, that mutual space that sees each individual, sees each experience, all the values in the room as valuable. And I think I want to stress also in terms of, sharing stories. It's not just about the economic value. It is about the holistic value of our sector. Once we only focus on the economic, I think we lose the power of the social and economic and therapeutic and transformational value of the sector, which matters in different ways for different people in different moments of our process. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. I mean, I get so excited around value and what that means for each individual and how that translates for our communities as well.
No, thank you for that. To me, I love how you unpacked that word value, because it's easy to use terms and have tunnel vision almost in how you view success, failure, or progress, or not, So I appreciate how you unpacked that. I'm going to just quickly read a couple of comments actually in the chat. So Tendai Farai says, building on best practice that Farai is speaking to, modern contemporary Africa has its own nuances that we can build on, as opposed to always looking to import cultures. I think that is really important, and speaks very much to also what you're saying to me around us being very, very deliberate in how we are doing things, very focused and localized, rather than just having a sort of broad-based approach. Chinesai says, shift in patterns. It's no longer about the top-down. Definitely agree with that. And Josiane, I want to bring you in here and maybe be a little disruptive, so please forgive me, and borrowing sort of from your international development hat a little bit. You know, are we even working within the right framework for Africa? The structures, the policies, the approaches, whether everything from, you know, the cultural policies that we have on the continent to the hubs concept, to the capacity building concept, is any of that even right for us? These are all imported concepts from a Western context. And we're taking them and we're using them and we're running with them. And if we're failing, is it not because that's not what's right for us as a continent, particularly as young people? Should we not be creating our own structures that work within what works best for us? Just to put you on the spot there.
I think that's a great question. I come from the schooling of you learn by failing, and you have to try and see. So I feel like we're trying something, like what you're doing is amazing. If, you know, in 3 years you think that you need to move on to something bigger, smaller, it's up to you to decide, but at least you've tried. Some seeds would have been planted, definitely. And I think that's what matters. I feel like when Tammy just talked about value, it's exactly what she meant. Like, everything is different. Everybody is different. The cultural landscape is so, you know, broad and large. I don't think that there's one book that will fit all. Like, everybody has to come up with some ideas, test it, see if it works for them. What works for me may not work for you. You have to try on your own and see if it's, you know, something that's good. We see a lot of artists that have great career internationally. It doesn't work for everybody. Some people could have like great career nationally, locally, in the small city, and they're happy with it. So I think the market is very large, which is great, because that means that there's a lot of diversity that we can bring in together, and everybody can collaborate somehow without feeling the pressure of, oh, you're doing the same thing as me. Maybe I'm in photography, but I'm in stock photography. I'm not doing art photography. I'm not doing wedding photography. So I can still work with you. We can still do some stuff together, but we don't feel like we're competing against each other. So I feel like that's the mindset to have, understanding that the market is large and broad. And then we can test a lot of things, and, you know, always be in the mindset of, if it doesn't work, I'm just going to change a little bit. If I'm doing photography and I see that there's too many wedding photographers, maybe I can educate myself. Again, talking about critical art education, see what works, maybe what aspiration do I have for my life, and see how you can bring it in your life. So education is definitely part of it. Understanding a lot of, somebody talked about a framework, a legal framework. I completely agree with policies and legal framework. A lot of time we don't understand what it means to license our creation. And we need to start there. Like, what does it mean to license locally, internationally? Does it mean that I give everything out, or do I retain some type of copyright or trademark? We need to understand that, because I've seen a lot of creativity being taken out of Africa and kind of being recreated outside of Africa, and there's no legal protection to the people who even started to create that product. So we definitely need to understand that, push our leaders to create policies that are in favor of what we need. We definitely need to push them, because there's no, I mean, from one country to another one, things are so different. You just like, you can't even you can't even understand it well. Like we work with contributors from so many countries. We are working, for example, on documents to highlight drone policies. Some countries, the information is very accessible, it's easy, you can find it and reshare it with your community. In some countries, it's what you hear from the contributors and what you see online on their website is two different things. So there's no alignment on what's real and what's written. So these are things that are not acceptable, because then you're not creating a sustainable community of creative, because if things are different from people to people, it's just not right for us. So we definitely need to push our leaders to create better policies to allow us to thrive.
That's a very valid point, yes, because the national policy has a big impact on how we then operate in the creative industries. So definitely lending our voices and advocating for those improved policies, maybe more customized policies, in thinking about what framework should we actually even be building. And the reason I asked that question is we have more so an informal economy in many parts of the continent. And Skinder, I'm going to ask you to come in here, because you touched on informality earlier, and you also talked about agility, which I think is really important, even in thinking about how we frame what we do. And with an appreciation, as Josiane has shared, that our policy leaders and legislative leaders rather don't always implement the good policies they create, and in some cases those policies just don't exist. So where that's the case, working within structured frameworks, perhaps that may work in the UK may not work for a young African creative in an environment where there isn't that supportive environment. So if we're going to break the mold of waiting for leadership to make things work, and we take those steps and be more agile and maybe say there needs to be another way, and maybe being an informal actor in an economy is not a bad thing. The measure of formality and informality is also a Western construct, actually. So Skinder, please do come in at this point and just share with us, particularly your British and international experience around informality and the creative industries and economic development. How do those things interplay? Does it work? Can you be informal and succeed? Can we rewrite the book and be a little bit agile, working within your sort of tenure and shorter cycles to say, does this work? Okay, if it doesn't, let's try something else. How would you tackle that?
Well, here's my sort of radical own way of working, which is kind of rubs up boards the wrong way sometimes. And as much as I talk about this 10-year cycle thing, I don't take it too seriously. What I do take seriously, though, is essence and purpose and vision and having substance around intent, and also genuine truth. Genuine truth means that we can seek the enlightened outcome. We're not hiding, we're not being crafty or cunning, but we're open book. I know, however, we need to use certain structures. So Josiane mentioned law and IP. This is a big thing in the creative industry. People can be exploited. So understanding that is really important. And so this the balance of getting structure so that it doesn't become stricture. Do you see what I mean? And that the structure is fluid, agile, and can bend. That isn't so solid. Some people think that, I read the other day, what was it? Yeah, like in a storm, a big tree might fall, but the little tree might survive. And yet the big tree was seen as the solid structure. But the little skinny trees seemed to survive the storm. Now, why was that? Well, it might be because the big structure was protecting the little structure. I don't know, but it may be something completely different. But I want to pick up on what Farai was saying as well about the targets, you know, and that sometimes I also think that we're so obsessed with targets and KPIs that we forget what it's all about. And so this kind of genuine truth and essence is really important to get right. And I think the reference to business schools from great universities, be them Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, etc., are useful, but are they adaptable and are they relevant for site-specific locations which have different cultural nuances, different ways of being, different ways of deciding, making choices? In African culture, there is I know I'm speaking quite broadly, but there is a kind of collaborative spirit, a kind of you're not alone here. You know, you're going together and we're working together as, you know, a village raises a child kind of concept. So I think, you know, it's important that, you know, we do things. And there were so many good points made. You know, Tumi made some really amazing points about customization, you know, mutual space or mutual outcome. And I think it's about the kind of multi-mutual sort of element to it. And so the kind of adaptive, agile approaches, these are really important. So as much as structure is there, I think it's the planning rather than the plan. And the plan will always change. It will always be iterative. And in this, it must be open. And we must be open to change. So it's about, okay, yes, we can have a 10-year plan. We can have a 20-year plan. And I was watching a great program the other day about how the British Olympic team changed their strategy, because they had a very informal sort of amateur approach in the 1980s and 90s, and they weren't winning medals. They were winning 3 or 4 goals here or there, if that, and it was a disaster mostly. And we said, well, that's what we do. You know, we go to these championships and we mess it up. But we can't be like this. So the lottery fund came and there was an investment. But they did have a plan and they did have a target. So I'm not saying throw targets out, because it did shift the Olympic team, you know, and you see today that, you know, Britain is no longer outside the top 10, it's in the top 5 even. You know, I'm just using the sports analogy. So it's not about being top, I know, you know, but it is about existing in a way that you're not exploited and that you control your destiny. And I always say, define or be defined, describe or be described. So, you know, this whole thing about Africa's state of mind that Felwine Sarr talks about is that there is a new consciousness. There is a kind of a skills base, an education that's coming from within. And that is something that one has to always see. And also being a British, South Asian, Punjabi dude, growing up in Birmingham, Nottingham, etc., you know, I have to say that had I not clustered and collaborated with black, brown kind of voices and ways of being, you know, I wouldn't have got to where I am today. And I'm not saying where I've got to today is some big deal, but in a sense it is a big deal, because if you think about what I can do. So Farai is talking about, you know, me being here is a good thing, because, you know, I'm going to be considerate about, you know, other ways of thinking and not become this kind of mad bureaucrat that just drives particular processing systems and, you know, tick boxes, this, that, and the other. You know, we need a bit of fluidity. We need a bit of soul. We need a bit of a party. We need to put art at the heart of party. You know, so this is what I'm saying, is that, you know, we you know, you like that, yeah? You know, art sits within party. So, you know, we need an approach that is plays with our cultural kind of vibe. Bring that to the table, and let's stop trying to be like you know, a Western textbook, you know, and stop trying to valorize and validate everything by the institution. I always remember in the UK, I was asked to join various circles when I was delivering New Art Exchange, and I refused. I said, I want to do it our way. I don't want to be what you are, because what you are is failing our communities. And if I do what you do, I'll replicate the status quo. So in a sense, you know, it's about finding something that challenges, that does disrupt, that does argue, that does have a battle, does have a bit of a headlock every now and then, but with the spirit of goodwill, good feeling, and solution. So I think that's my approach. You know, and I you know, just hearing everybody today, I mean, I really get great sense of some really amazing ideas, and this is what we need to hear more and deliver it. Then, you know, just get on with it, make things happen. Oh, and by the way, I love Josiane's thing. Try and see. I think there is something there that's really interesting. I can see a program coming out of this. That let's just try and see what happens, and bring these great collaborators into one room and see what evolves. You know, and see where the chemistry goes.
I love that, Skinder, because we're often, as Farai said earlier, we're often working within boxes, and I love, and it's also very important and a very, very big deal that you sit where you do, because you have the power to unbox those boxes and allow us to try and see and work in spaces, and collaborate in ways on the continent that actually just fosters innovation, and indigenous innovation, not prescribed, not imported, but indigenous, sort of looking back to our heritage, fusing it with technology from the number 6 of the 6-pack, and saying, hey, let's just see what will happen. Let's just try and see. I love that. And we need to be doing more programs that just allow space to do that. And I have to hand it to Farai and the British Council team in Zimbabwe, who I've worked with for a number of years. They've always let me try and see and let me create and come to them with crazy ideas sometimes, but it's always supportive, it's always collaborative, it's always partnership first, and it's always, you know, not locally developed and grown ideas pushing forward, pushing boundaries. So that's something that the British Council has already been doing, and we're excited that you're going to keep that and maybe even amplify that approach, because it allows then for us to say, you know what, formal, informal, these are just boxes. We don't want to be in boxes. You know, in fact, from today, we're not going to be informal or formal. We're going to be ecosystem and connected. And, you know, the phrase you were referring to earlier is Ubuntu, the togetherness. And what I love is last year at the SoCreative Summit, in the 2020 Summit, our theme song was by a local musician, Farai, and that song is actually titled Ubuntu. It's, you know, we are who we are because of all the people around us. It's the connectedness. So we can be connected creatives who are economically viable rather than necessarily formal or informal, and, you know, in these sort of boxes that don't adequately describe us, but then also don't adequately allow us to be agile and to innovate and create. And Farai, I want you to come in here and just speak to this conversation about structure, boxes, and formality, informality from your perspective, and a little bit with your sort of UNESCO bigger picture thinking hat globally, framed from the perspective of innovation, because ultimately what we need to be, and certainly as a sector, what we need to be championing and supporting the African Union and our governments to embrace, but certainly even at our level, at sector level, at ecosystem level, at individual level, we need to be promoting and driving innovation systems thinking that allow us the agility and the scope to, you know, throw away the framework that constrains us from progress. Farai, please come in and just share some thoughts around this.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. And it's exciting to hear all the different perspectives. Just perhaps an answer to your question you posed earlier, is the global system for development right for Africa? The answer is certainly no. Is, say, for example, Culture Fund, where I'm director, part of the global system of development that's archaic and needs change? The answer is yes. How do we change that? We change that by seeing the demand on the ground by especially younger Africans ecosystems. I've been fortunate that I have worked on both sides as a director of Culture Fund, able to work with localized, customized ecosystems over the years. And on the other hand, working with UNESCO, looking at government and continental and global institutional paradigms. So on the local, customized local level, for example, you see some of the things happening on the African continent. I give an example of Nigeria, the music and the film, organically grown cultural creative industries that were laced with the nuances of Nigeria. And the policy making frameworks around that are catching up in Nigeria. We had a webinar just last week with the Copyright Commission of Nigeria, who are now looking at what is going on now with this Nollywood business of film and music, and what sort of arbitration are they having to facilitate in order for the intellectual property of the creators of the works so that they are protected. So the organically growing ecosystems are important to track and see what's going on. At some point, though, these smaller localized ecosystems will need to interface with more national, regional, and intercontinental structures that are often slower to change. The British councils, the IMFs, the World Banks, in a very modest, small way, the culture funds in Zimbabwe, right? But the reality is that some among us will need to be people like me, stuck in offices, not so sexy, not so exciting jobs every day, looking at policy frameworks, and to fix that. And not allow the more, innovative, free, creative people to be burdened by, investment pipelines that don't work properly, intellectual property frameworks that are not quite correct, and cultural policies that are misaligned to digital environments. So some among us will need to take up those careers and also be able to share with others what is actually happening already on the African continent. So, like you said, with my UNESCO head, it's important to know that 20 years ago, together with a guy called Mike van Kraai in South Africa, when he was the Secretary General of Arterial Network, we embarked, 6 of us, on generic cultural policies for African governments. The exercise was not as successful because few of the African governments were ready to embrace cutting-edge, digitally sensitive cultural policies. But there's an energy that's reviving now. And why is it reviving? Because the presidents of the African Union themselves are taking arts and culture seriously. You yourself quoted their theme for this year, which is arts and culture, the lever for the Africa we want, as this year's theme. Now, there's one way, it's one thing saying it at a bigger, continental political gathering, and another doing it. But we are seeing that both are happening in the African continent. We are seeing the pronouncements by these new leaders who are seeming to now wanting a different kind of approach to fixing the superstructure of the policy framework, right? But we also have the Africa Development Bank, and then we also have the Afrexim Bank, which announced a facility that's going to support with $500 million cultural and creative industries. But for you to interface with that, you've got to be perhaps become big creative industry. And once you are bidding for money from a bank, you interface with big institutional systems and processes. But what we want is these things to be seamless, so that an individual fashion designer doesn't have to be burdened to know the cultural policy of Zimbabwe, the frameworks of the Afrexim facility on venture capital pipelines that are open, but we actually simplify the interface between these institutional but very necessary if you want to operate in a global system that talks to institutions with an institution. right? So I think bottom line for me, if I do not have another chance to come in, is what are we trying to build and what are we trying to foster? What kind of trees are we trying to grow in young Africans, for example, to take the metaphor of the tree from Skinder, is an African-centered creative who will reflect the cultural nuances of the continent. And the continent is in its total diversity, right? But also digitally and internationally skilled and astute. That's the kind of young African that will be able to produce cultural and creative goods and services that are able to compete globally. When you have that and you've got a clear plan, then you start telling the story of these emerging successes, and then you help them compete globally. We are seeing what the Koreans have done with the Korea Wave, the Hallyu, with the Korean drama and the Korean K-pop, K-drama and K-pop. With all its weaknesses around enslavement of those trained, stars and so forth, at the service of these big corporates now, but that the Korean government and Korean culture has benefited from the innovation of K-drama and K-pop, that some are even arguing that they are able to sell more the Samsung phones and the vehicles because now Korean culture has become more globally palatable. And they figured it out, and so the institutional, legal, intellectual property frameworks in South Korea by government are catching up and enabling the innovation and the global business that has emerged out of the Korean cultural wave. So in Africa, we'll certainly not have one big solution, but we are tracking the things that are going on in the different countries and then the different ecosystems within individual countries. And where there are signs of something emerging that's interesting, then it is up to us, the institutions, to now start working differently. And often maybe instead of asking people to put in these boring, complex project proposal forms, is to have an editorial approach to development where we actually go and say, you are doing a good thing. What can we do within your project to make it grow over 3-4 years? Don't fill in an application form. Let's us study what you're doing, and we will bring in our people to do the boring administrative things. We are not there yet. British Council is not there yet. Culture Fund is not there yet. But that's the direction that we need to go.
I love that, Farai. I really love that. Talent scouting. Let's talent scout, not ask for proposals. And when we find the talent, let's learn, let's research, borrowing from Skinder's passion and focus. Let's research, let's learn, and then let's implement. Time is not on our side, and I literally cannot stop having this conversation, but unfortunately we need to wrap up now to allow for the next part of the program. So thank you so much for picking that up, Farai, and giving us some closing points. I want to invite Tumi, then Josiane, and then finally Skinder to also just share just a few sort of parting points around enabling the ecosystem of young African creatives. Please do just, very quickly, just your last points around how can we enable the creative economy to grow as we wrap up our round.
Wow, thank you. Sure, I have like 3 pages of notes that I've taken today. I think the question that keeps coming up in my mind is, which narratives have been erased about how the creative economy worked on this continent? And why was that erased? And how can we tap into that? Because a lot of the frameworks and the ideas and the narratives and suggestions and strategies we're developing have always been there. So it almost feels like we're reinventing the wheel. We have forgotten a part of us that was actually compelling, that was progressive, and that was Pan-African. How can we tap into those erased and excluded narratives? Because I think there lies some really great suggestions about how we can move towards this Africa that we want. I think I'm going to end it there. I think there's so much that has been shared. This community approach, this ecosystem approach has always been there. That's why the philosophy of Ubuntu keeps popping up. It's because that's who we are. That's how we've been working anyways. And that's how the creative sector was since inception. So now we're trying to put things into boxes and circles and triangles when the thing is so rapid, it's so broad, it's so complex, it's so nuanced that it doesn't need to be boxed or constricted. What are those narratives that have been excluded, and how can we tap into those? Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. It's been so illuminating.
Yeah, it's been amazing to listen to all of the panelists. Thank you so much. I will end by just saying that how do we enable the creative economy? It just starts with all of us, even if we are creative ourselves. It starts with how we consume and how we ask people to consume. So do we buy art? Do we consume our local art? Do we help them? Do we show up when they produce something? Do we appreciate? I think it really all starts with us. And then slowly by slowly, that's definitely seeds that we are planting and enable people to also start learning about it and appreciate art. Some of us have families and kids, same thing, like how do we bring on our families? How do we go to a play and see like a play at school or in our neighborhood? How do we go to a concert and support the local artists? It really starts with us and how we can show appreciation to any level of art. Farai, you talked about Nollywood. Nollywood comes in so many different shape and form. Not everybody loves everything about Nollywood. Some of it is good, some of it is less good, but it's there and it's there for everybody. And I think that's the beauty about the creative sector. It's there for everybody. You can't be upset or unhappy. You can only appreciate it. So thank you so much for this moment and this opportunity. It's been amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, and yeah, wise words as ever from everyone. I'll just close by going back to what I started with, and that is to enable the fertile ground with a multiple sort of layering of new seeds, with a powerful six-packed engine, and that you as creatives that you seek your circles of truth. And determine your distinct personalized fingerprint as a creative expressionist or creative business or entrepreneur, and believe in your story and make your story available in a collaborative way. I think I'll leave it there for now.
I love that. Make your story available in a collaborative way. Really, that's so powerful and very, very true. Thank you, all of you, so much for spending the morning with us and unpacking some of these not easy theories and topics. I think it's been really insightful. I've certainly learned a lot and definitely take away a lot of the points that you've all shared. I've got my 6-pack and I'm going to start unpacking and implementing that. I'm already thinking about how to pitch a project that is editorial focused, but that also brings in to me the idea of going back and, think of that edu-culture, going back to learn about what we did before and then bring in some of the new and modern nuances to then maybe reshape and in an agile way, retell our stories. And I'm sure between Culture Fund and British Council, we can make that happen based on where you sit and your passion and commitment to platforms like this and the creative entrepreneurs and social impact entrepreneurs on the continent. Thank you again to the panel for your really great and rich contribution. Rutendo, back to you.